So, good evening. So, mag-start na tayo. Yung topic natin for today ay about freedom of speech. So, ito yung fifth topic natin for our series na Christianity and Politics. And our intent is for Christians to have solid foundations sa mga issues na related sa politics. So, yung basis nitong topic natin for today ay ang book ni Wayne Grudem na Politics According to the Bible. So, I suggest na you read yung book if you want to learn more. Actually, siya nga yung nag-ano sa akin convert din sa conservatism. So, very, malaki yung utang ko rin kay Grudem in terms of my political views. So, to start, ito yung outline ng pag-uusapan natin today. So, first, we will discussing biblical teaching about freedom of speech. Next, we will talk about yung context sa ating constitution, yung sa laws. Then, we will discuss yung restrictions on freedom of speech. And lastly, we will talk about hate speech codes and other restrictions on free speech on college campuses. So ito naman is sa US context, although we can learn from it then na in case mangyari here, we know na what we can do, ganun, or how to think about it in case mangyari. So let's start muna sa biblical support or sa biblical teaching about freedom of speech. So dito magdi-discuss tayo ng 5 points. Ayan. So yung 5 points dito is first, to prevent the abuse of power by government. Second, to enable government to be chosen by the people. Third, to protect human liberty. Fourth, to protect religious speech. And 5, to protect the ability of individuals to think and decide issues for themselves. First, let's talk muna about the prevention of abuse of power ng gobyerno. Ang sabi sa Romans 3:23 ay, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." This shows na walang tao that can claim na righteous sila dahil lahat tayo ay nag-fall short sa demands ni God. And ang sin na ito is said to touch the heart of every individual na human being. Ang sinasabi pa nga ng Bible is not merely nang sin touched our hearts, pero every aspect of our humanity ay affected ng sin. Dahil dito, we can say na people who have power ay laging may temptation to use their power for their own benefit or sa benefit ng kanilang friends and family and not really for the benefit ng kanilang mga nasasakupan. We can say na dahil sa sin in the heart of man, ang government power tends to corrupt people. Sa 1 Samuel 8:11-17 ay sabi, he said, "This is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take a tenth of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. Your male and female servants and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own use. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves." Sa passage na ito ay Samuel warned the people of Israel dahil sa pag-request nila for a king. And he warned them about sa corrupting influence ng power ng king where he will enrich himself kaysa iserve nito mismo yung mga tao. We can see further na viewed ito negatively dahil sa verse 18 ay sabi na sa day na mangyari ito ay Israel will cry out dahil sa kanilang king na pinili. Pero si God will not answer them. We see further ang depravity ng tao dahil kahit may warning na binigay si Samuel, ay di sila nakikinig and they still warned to have a king tulad ng ibang nation. Another passage na magandang account ng corrupting influence ng power ay makikita sa 2 Samuel 11, 1-27. Yung passage naman na ito is about David and Bathsheba. So in this narrative, we see na si David ay nanatili sa Jerusalem instead of being in battle. And he abused his power by laying with her. Dahil nabuntis niya si Bathsheba, he tried to cover up ang kanyang crime by trying to get Uriah, yung asawa ni Bathsheba, to lay with her. Pero ayaw ni Uriah dahil hindi niya kaya to eat and drink and lie with his wife during the time of battle. This made David instruct Joab na ilagay si Uriah sa pinakaharap ng battle kung saan pinaka-intense yung labanan. And then iiwan nila si Uriah for him to die. Clearly ay ginamit ni David dito ang power niya to commit adultery and for him to cover it up. For this reason, ay important na we safeguard ang freedom of speech sa ating society kasi it helps restrain ang government officials dahil it makes them more accountable sa mga tao. And ang freedom of speech kasi allows the people to speak out and criticize the government when they think na gumagawa ito ng mali. Second point, ang freedom of speech enables ang government to be chosen by the people. We can say na ang Bible ay nagbigay ng indirect na support sa idea na dapat chosen by the people ang government. Sa Genesis 1:27 ay sabi, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them." And if ang pagiging made in the image of God ay true of all human beings, syempre, walang isang tao or family na may special right to act as royalty or to rule over all of us without our consent. So 2 Samuel 2:4 we read, "And the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah." Dito naman ay we see ang people of Judah ang mismong pumili kay David to be their own king. Another passage is in Romans 13:4 where it says, "For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer." So, of course, though this specific passage talks about the governing authorities, ay God's instrument in punishing the evildoer. Notice yung words na ginamit, he is God's servant for your good. This means na ang government ay hindi nag-exist solely for the good or enrichment ng governing authorities, but for the good of the people mismo. And yung nag-determine kung anong best for the people ay yung tao mismo. This means na kailangan natin ng some kind of democracy. For this reason, we can say na important ang freedom of speech sa isang bansa. Kasi ang mga tao can express their own ideas kung anong klaseng policy ba dapat ang i-adopt ng kanilang government. And they can talk about kung anong klaseng kandidato ang dapat nakaupo sa pwesto. Dahil dito ay necessary ang freedom of speech para maprotektahan ng mismong democracy. Pag wala kasing freedom of speech at freedom of the press, then ang mga nakaupo sa pwesto ay kaya isuppress ang kahit anong criticism ng actions nila and pwede nila pagbawalan ang mga kalaban na politiko o kaya ang mga kritiko nila na express ang mga views nila in public. This would result sa pagkawala ng true democracy sa isang bansa. Third point, para maprotektahan ng human liberty. We can see sa Exodus 22 ay sabi, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." Though yung context nito is about the 10 Commandments, by principle, sa historical prologue niya, kung saan ay reminded ang Israelites ng rescue ni God sa kanila, we can see that God does not desire that they may be enslaved. Dahil sa principle na ito, we can say na important sa isang gobyerno na masigurang liberty ng bawat individual. Ang isang significant na part ng human liberty ay ang ability nila na ma-express yung ideas nila freely. Kung saan ay they can attempt to persuade ang iba sa mga ideas na yun. Ito ay isa pang dahilan kung bakit kailangan maprotekta ng freedom of speech at ng press sa isang bansa. Fourth point, para maprotektahan ng religious speech. Pag protektado kasi ang freedom of speech sa isang lipunan, then ang religious speech ay mapoprotektahan din. Important ito na i-defend ng mga Christians kasi this enables us to proclaim the gospel freely in public. Freely natin ma-obey ang Great Commission without us na matatakot for censorship or punishment. Fifth, para maprotekta ng abilidad ng mga individuals na mag-isip at para mag-decide sila on issues for themselves. Ang sabi sa Deuteronomy 30:19, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore, choose life, that you and your offspring may live. Clearly, dito sa speech ni Moses, bago siya succeeded ni Joshua, na he set before God's people ang different na options, and he urged them to choose life. Based on the principle we see in this passage, we can say na ang ability for people to think and decide ang mga issues freely means na dapat ay may access sila sa arguments sa all sides ng issue. And this can only be made possible if permitted ang freedom of speech sa isang society and kung ang iba't ibang viewpoint sa issue ay pwede na freely expressed. And so we just finished talking about yung biblical teaching about freedom of speech. So ngayon we will talk about sa Constitution. Ang sabi sa Section 4, Article 3 of our Bill of Rights, no law shall be passed abridging the freedom of speech, of expression, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances. Basically, yung mga listed here ay bawal gumawa ng kahit anong batas na mag-restrict yung sa mga bagay na listed. Freedom of speech, expression ng press, yung right of assembly, and yung petition ng government. So yung freedom of speech ayon kay Justice Scalia ay ang freedom sa paggamit natin ng ating faculty of speech. This suggests na ang freedom of the press is to engage sa activity by using naman yung printing press. Ayon kay Eugene Volokh ng UCLA Law, ay kung wala ang freedom of the press, ay hindi natin makikita na kasama ang freedom of speech sa printing. Ang freedom na ito ay hindi limited sa isang industry, pero applicable ito sa lahat ng tao. Sa freedom of speech ay may dalawang prohibitions na ginagawa. Ito ay ang prior restraint at ang subsequent punishment. Ang prior restraint ay kung may official na government restriction in advance ng actual na speech. Ang subsequent punishment naman is ang pag-punish ng government after ng actual na speech. Let me explain ang dalawang prohibitions sa freedom of speech just for us to have a grasp kung ano yung dalawa na ito. Some examples ng prior restraint ay ang pag-suppress ng isang publication or ang pag-censor ng isang movie or ang injunction ng court against publication ng certain material. As a general rule, ang prior restraint ay considered as unconstitutional. Some exceptions dito ay kapag ang nation ay at war, or if involved ang publication ng location and number of troops, or if ang isang publication ay nag-incite ng violence. One example ng case na related dito ay ang Iglesia ni Cristo versus Court of Appeals. Makikita dito na ang religious speech ay pwede lamang ma-inhibit pag may presence ng clear and present danger. Na kapag ang speech ay nag-advocate for people to be hostile or violent sa tao na may ibang religious views. Ang mere criticism na mali yung ibang religion ay hindi considered as obscene and violent, so protected siya na speech. Sa subsequent punishment naman or sa pag-punish ng government after ng actual na speech ay may 3 tests para masabi na allowable ang subsequent punishment ng expression. Ang 3 tests ay ang dangerous tendency test, ang clear and present danger test, and ang balancing interest test. Ang dangerous tendency test shows na ang speech ay pwede ma-curtail or punish pag nag-create ito ng dangerous tendency kung saan ang state ay may right to prevent it. Si Joaquin Bernas, isang kilalang constitutionalist ay sabi, quote, "In the early stages of Philippine jurisprudence, the accepted rule was that speech may be curtailed or punished when it creates a dangerous tendency which the state has a right to prevent." End quote. Ang requirement para masabi na punishable ang speech ay if may rational na connection between the speech made and ang evil na apprehended. Next na test naman ang clear and present danger test. Dito ay tinitignan kung ang mga words na ginamit ba ay of such a nature na mag-create siya ng clear and present danger na magdala ito ng evils na ang Congress ay may right na pigilan. Ang case na example sa test na ito ay ang Dennis versus US. Ang tinuturo ng case na ito ay ang talk about sa pag-attempt na i-overthrow ang government by force and violence ay hindi protected ng free speech clause. Ang pag-overthrow ng government by force and violence ay substantial enough na interest para sa state to limit ang speech. Lastly, ang balancing interest test. Dito naman ay sinasabi na ang function ng court sa isang case ay kapag nakita na may public interest na served sa legislation at kapag ang freedoms ay affected doon. And so, pag ganun, yung kailangan ay mabalance ito at mag-arrive sa judgment kung saan may better na way. One example dito yung sa Ayer Productions versus Judge Capulong. Ang case na ito ay tungkol kay Enrile. Gusto niya kasi napigilan ng isang director na gumawa ng movie tungkol sa EDSA Revolution kasi ini-invade nito ang kanyang right to privacy. Dito ay valid ang movie and hindi dapat pigilan ang publication. Ito ay dahil isang public figure si Enrile. Sa balancing of interest test ay sa intrusion ay fairly reasonable para maging truthful ang film. Pero dapat ay limited ito to non-private matters. Ang isang limited na intrusion sa privacy ay regarded na permissible kung ang isang tao ay considered as a public figure at kapag ang information na nakuha sa kanya ay matters of public character. Yung purpose ng interest is to protect ang right to privacy and para hindi wrongfully ma-publicize ang private affair na outside sa realm ng legitimate public concern. So ngayon, we just talked about two prohibitions of freedom of speech, which are prior restraint and subsequent punishment. Though bawal mag-make ng law na nag-restrict ng freedom of speech, syempre ang freedom na ito ay hindi absolute. So let me give some examples ng mga form of speech na hindi protected ng batas. So let me enumerate each of them. Tapos let's discuss each. So first is defamation. Second, incitement to riot. Third, obscenity. And fourth, child pornography. So una, let's talk about defamation. So ito ang speech na nag-harm sa reputation ng ibang tao. Ito ay ang mga speech na naglabag sa mga batas laban sa libel and slander. Sa Crimes Against Honor ng Revised Penal Code sa Article 353, ang libel ay defined as, quote, a public and malicious imputation of a crime or of a vice or defect, real or imaginary, or any act, omission, condition, status, or circumstance tending to cause the dishonor, discredit, or contempt of a natural or juridical person or to blacken the memory of one who is dead, end quote. We can see sa Article 355 ay nag-refer sa means ng writing and other expressions. Ang sabi doon ay, quote, a libel committed by means of writing, printing, lithography, engraving, radio, phonograph, painting, theatrical exhibition, cinematographic exhibition, or any similar means shall be punished by prison correctional in its minimum and medium periods or a fine ranging from 200 to 6,000 pesos or both, in addition to the civil action which may be brought by the offended party. End quote. Ayon sa batas natin ay kahit totoo pang sinabi ng tao ay considered na with malice ito kung walang good intention or justifiable motive ang tao in making such a statement. May exceptions kung saan they consider na walang malice ang defamatory words. Ang una ay kung ito ay isang private na communication na sinasabi sa ibang tao as a performance of one's legal, moral, or social duty. Ang pangalawa is kung ito ay fair at good report na made in good faith, na walang comments or remarks sa mga official proceedings na hindi confidential in nature. Yung slander naman ay defined as oral defamation sa Article 358. This means na siniraan mo ang tao by using yung faculty mo of speech. Ang pangalawa naman na example ng hindi protected na speech ay yung incitement to riot. Ito ay mga salita na nag-promote ng panic at harm sa mga tao. Ito ay pag sumigaw ka ng may sunog sa isang crowded na theater. Also kung nag-joke ka na may bomba pag nasa airport ka. Third na example ay obscenity. Sa obscenity naman ay walang perfect na definition at yung issue ay treated on a case-by-case basis sa discretion ng judge. Though we can see sa Miller test ay may helpful na 3-part definition ng isang obscene na material. First, ang isang gawa ay legally considered na obscene if ang isang average na tao would find na ang isang material ay nag-appeal sa sexual desires or interest ng tao. Second, kung ang isang gawa ay nag-describe in an offensive way ang isang sexual na conduct or excretory na functions. Third, kung ang isang material ay kulang sa serious na literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. So if nag-fail sa Miller test, considered na obscene yung isang material and therefore hindi na siya magiging protected na speech or expression. Pang-apat ay ang child pornography. Sa ating Untitled Pornography Act of 2009 ay dahil kinikilala ng ating gobyerno ang role ng kabataan sa pag-build ng ating bansa ay dapat protektahan ng kanilang physical, moral, spiritual, intellectual, emotional, psychological, and social well-being. For this reason, syempre, kailangan sila maprotektahan sa lahat ng forms of exploitation and abuse. And kasama rito ang paggamit sa mga bata sa mga pornographic na performance or materials. Hindi lamang ito nag-apply sa mga bata, pero pati sa mga tao na regardless ng kanilang age ay portrayed sila as mga bata. Restrictions on free speech. So, ngayon, we just finished talking about unprotected speech sa ating law. Ngayon naman, we will talk about 2 examples ng restriction ng free speech na we can say na nag-violate sa ating rights. Ang pag-uusapan natin dito yung Republic Act 11313 or yung Safe Spaces Act and yung HB 6294 or yung SOGI Equality Act. So let's start sa Republic Act number 11313 or yung Safe Spaces Act. So sa Section 3 ng Act na ito, defined yung catcalling as referring to unwanted remarks directed towards a person, commonly done in the form of wolf whistling and misogynistic, transphobic, homophobic, and sexist slurs. So yung nagpahirap dito ay yung term na unwanted na remarks, which could be directed to a person. Tapos categorize na kasama rito ang insulting and disparaging remark or slur. Ang definition ng insult ay isa itong offensive na remark or action, and it seems na maraming negative unintended consequences na pwede mangyari dahil sa subjectivity ng law na ito. Wala kasing exemption na ginawa, for example, sa academic freedom or sa religious beliefs. I'm afraid na if I say na sin ng homosexuality, then it could be considered as a homophobic na slur, which is pasok siya sa catcalling na definition sa law na ito. And mapaparusahan ako for violating it as a result. Another example ay ang SOGI Equality Act. Dito naman ulitin ko yung part where I discussed sa homosexuality topic natin na may kinalaman sa freedom of speech. Sa letter L ng Section 4 ay sabi, quote, engaging in public speech meant to shame, insult, vilify, or which tends to incite or normalize the commission of discriminatory practices against the LGBT, in which acts or practices in turn intimidate them or result in the loss of their self-esteem. End quote. So ito pareho siya sa 2017 version na walang religious exemption. Yung problem ko rito is it violates the Constitution. Sabi sa Article 3, Section 4 ng ating Bill of Rights, no law shall be passed abridging the freedom of speech, of expression, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances. Dito ay we can see ang violation kasi ang sabi is what is considered as a violation ay ang public speech na mag-intimidate or lessen ang self-esteem ng isang LGBT. This is subjective na if you talk to them about, for example, yung homosexuality being a sin, it may intimidate them or lessen their self-esteem. And sabi ay public speech na meant to shame, insult, or vilify. Pero paano ba natin objectively malalaman yung intent ng isang tao? This is something na sobrang hirap malaman. So yung subjectivity ng section na ito may force people na ma-curtail yung kanilang freedom of speech. Sa Article 3, Section 5 naman ay sabi, no law shall be made respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, The free exercise and enjoyment of religious profession and worship without discrimination or preference shall forever be allowed. No religious test shall be required for the exercise of civil or political rights. And syempre, sa Section 5, we can see na hindi lang ang freedom of speech ang affected, but prohibited din yung free exercise ng ating religion. Kasi we will not be able to freely share ang beliefs natin dahil sa fear na maaari tayo maparusahan dahil sa bill if maging law ito. So ngayon, we just finished talking about restrictions of free speech by talking about the Safe Spaces Act and yung SOGI Equality Act as examples. So next, we will talk naman about sa isang example sa US about restriction on free speech. Ang pag-uusapan natin dito ay about campus hate speech codes at ibang restriction on free speech sa college campuses. So sa US, yung Foundation for Individual Rights in Education ay nag-report na 253 ng public universities ay may speech code policies na pwede magamit para i-restrict ang free speech. At kasama dito ang freedom of speech. And ito ay 97% ng lahat ng public universities. Ang mga speech na regulations na ito ay adopted para pagbawalan or parusahan ang mga speech na mag-offend sa mga tao dahil sa kanilang race, gender, religion, disability, national origin, or sexual orientation. And dahil dito, ay of course yung gospel ay censored at ang expression ng Christian moral values. Dahil sa hate speech codes na mga ito ay minsan ang mga students ay penalized dahil sa pag-express nila ng belief sa gospel ni Jesus Christ or sa pag-attempt nila to share their faith sa iba. Sa ibang cases naman ay penalize ang mga Christians sa pag-express ng kanilang moral values tulad ng conviction ng homosexual conduct ay contrary sa scripture or ang pag-support nila sa Proposition 8 ng California kung saan ay defined dito na ang marriage ay between one man and one woman. Buti na lang ay may mga Christian na legal organizations tulad ng Alliance Defense Fund na nag-challenge sa mga policies tulad nito. Ang claim nila ay unconstitutional na violation ito ng First Amendment na nag-guarantee ng freedom of speech. One example nito ay sa Georgia Tech University. So doon ay nag-enact ng speech code na nag-prohibit ang tinatawag nila na acts of intolerance. So they funded ang religious student groups at fostered ang mga religious view na nag-affirm ng homosexual behavior and shunned ang mga hindi nag-affirm ng homosexual behavior. Pagkatapos mag-file ng kaso ng Alliance Defense Fund, yung mga officials ng Savannah State University sa Georgia ay nagsettle agad sa student group that was dismissed from campus kasi raw ay nag-engage sila in harassment. When in fact ay nag-share lang naman sila ng faith nila sa ibang students. Nag-engage rin daw sila sa hazing when in reality ay nag-engage lang sila sa biblical practice na foot washing. So yung group na ito dahil sa pag-file ng case ay nabalik sa campus. Second, yung discrimination naman laban sa mga Christian organizations. One example dito ay sa Rutgers University. Sila ay gumamit ng non-discrimination na statement na nag-require sa isang inter-varsity Christian fellowship na group na mag-accept ng leaders na nag-reject ng kanilang Christian beliefs. Pag mag-refuse sila, ay denied sila ng right to meet sa campus at bawal sila gumamit ng campus facilities para ma-promote ang kanilang meetings. So dito, nagsampa ulit ng kaso yung ADF at ang school dropped their effort agad. Dahil sa incident na ito ay nag-comment si Laura and Graham na, quote, "One can only imagine if a group of devout Christians tried to join a Rutgers lesbian student group. The Christians would probably be brought up on disciplinary charges accused of violating Rutgers' principle of community." End quote. In light of this, syempre, I would like to read a quote from Tim Keller to help us understand na isang community cannot be completely inclusive as opposed dun sa gusto nila mangyari na magiging official org ka lang if yung leaders ng org mo ay contrary dun sa values na gusto niya i-uphold. So yung sabi ni Tim Keller sa Reason for God, quote, Consider an illustration. Imagine that one of the board members of the local gay, lesbian, and transgender community center announces, "I've had a religious experience, and now I believe homosexuality is a sin." As the weeks go by, he persists in making that assertion. Imagine that a board member of the Alliance Against Same-Sex Marriage announces, "I discovered that my son is gay, and I think he has the right to marry his partner." No matter how personally gracious and flexible the members of each group are, the day will come when each group will have to say, "You must step off the board because you don't share a common commitment with us." The first of these communities has the reputation for being inclusive, and the second for being exclusive. But in practice, both of them operate in almost the very same way. Each is based on common beliefs that act as boundaries, including some and excluding others. Neither community is being narrow, they are just being communities. Any community that did not hold its members accountable for specific beliefs and practices would have no corporate identity and would not really be a community at all. We cannot consider a group exclusive simply because it has standards for its members. Is there then no way to judge whether a community is open and caring rather than narrow and oppressive? Yes, there is. Here is a far better set of tests. Which community has beliefs that lead its members to treat persons in other communities with love and respect, to serve them and meet their needs? Which community's beliefs lead it to demonize and attack those who violate their boundaries, rather than treating them with kindness, humility, and winsomeness? We should criticize Christians when they are condemning and ungracious to unbelievers, but we should not criticize churches when they maintain standards for membership in accord with their beliefs. Every community must do the same. End quote. In conclusion, ang mga hate speech codes na yan ay wrong na restriction ng freedom of speech. Napigilan nito ang mga conservative na moral and religious ideas to speak, and mas madali nila na na-indoctrinate yung mga bata ng mga mas liberal na views. Naggawa ito gamit ang mga state universities na may funding na mula sa taxpayers. So mali yung hate speech codes na ito dahil they violate ang biblical value ng freedom of speech at dahil violation din ito ng Constitution. Kung ang freedom of speech ay hindi pinoprotektahan ng mga speech na maaari maka-offend sa iba, then hindi talaga ito freedom of speech. Ang argument na may ibang tao na baka ma-offend sa mga sinasabi natin ay mas appropriate na argument sa pag-advise sa speaker na maging mas thoughtful sa kanyang speech. Pero hindi siya argument na ang kahit anong batas or university policy ay dapat gamitin para magkaroon ng penalty ang isang speaker. Hindi rin totoo na pag mag-express tayo ng moral na opposition sa isang action ay mag-lead ito sa violence sa iba. Ang example nito is pag sinabi natin na mali ang abortion ay automatic na magiging violent na yung mga tao sa gumagawa ng abortion. Ang speech dapat para tama na i-restrict ng batas ay dapat nag-cause ito directly ng actual na harm sa ibang tao, tulad ng pag-incite ng riot sa isang crowded na theater. Kailangan natin ng freedom of speech para magkaroon ng free discussion ng differences, and this will allow democracy to work properly sa ating country. In summary, we talked about the biblical teaching regarding freedom of speech, the Constitution, and then we talked about unprotected speech and also about restrictions of freedom of speech. Lastly, we talked about an example sa freedom of speech sa US as an example which we can possibly learn from and watch out for then in case mangyari sa atin. So tapos na tayo sa ating discussion sa freedom of speech. Now we can proceed sa question and answer portion.